"Wee Willie Wee, wake up." And then Gardner put a fist into a little boy's head, a little boy named Willie, to wake him up in the morning in Seattle, Washington. Every day. "Wee Willie Wee, wake up." And a fist went to the side of Willie's head. Year after year, he was awakened that way. Till Willie was 13 years old. And at 13, he'd grown to 6 feet tall. And his father, Gardner, came into the room one morning, and Willie was already awake. And Willie got out of bed, and he stood up in front of his father, and he said, "If you ever hit me again, I'll kill you." Willie didn't like the name Willie much growing up. He became Bill by the time he was 15. His name was Bill Gwinn. He was my dad. My dad didn't know what had happened to him as a child. He thought it was normal. He thought that what his father did somehow made him the man that he became. He became a father himself, and he ultimately used discipline, physical discipline, and verbal and emotional power and control on his children, like his father had. Because his father also at times whipped him so that he couldn't walk. And when he had kids, he decided to at times whip them so they couldn't walk. And that included me. And when I was growing up with it, I thought it was normal. I thought it was what fathers did to their kids. And I loved my dad. And I was proud of my dad. And he did great things in his life. My dad was proud of his father. His father in 1937 was called the richest man in Seattle, Washington. He was a powerful man. He was the president of the Seattle Rotary Club. He was the chair of the elder board of Seattle Presbyterian Church. There are buildings named after my grandfather in Seattle, Washington. So my dad loved his dad, and I loved my dad. And I didn't know whether it wasn't normal until I became a prosecutor. And in 1986, I actually put the first man in jail for child abuse in my career who did to his son what my father had done to me. And I began to realize it wasn't okay. But I didn't tell anybody what had happened to me because there was too much shame and too much humiliation to tell my story. Today I stand before you saying that if we are going to be people of hope, we need to be people that celebrate the survival from violence and abuse in human beings. And we need to be people that reject shame. We don't convey shame. We don't promote shame. And we reject shame in our own lives. That's how we want to start this morning. Christian started it so perfectly, telling his story. T.S. Eliot said many years ago, "In my beginning is my end." Without the work that you all do, T.S. Eliot was right. With the work you all do, T.S. Eliot is wrong. What's happening right now in the United States is, I believe, the most exciting thing that has ever happened in the work that we do. We are beginning to see something that has been hidden in plain sight for decades, for centuries, for millennia. the significance of violence and abuse on children and its impact on adult illness, disease, and criminality is today indisputable. And we're beginning to see it, and not see it as something that is inevitable, but something that we can change with the power of our work together. This is Andreas Lubitz. On March 24th, Andreas Lubitz became a mass murderer. He killed 149 people on Germanwings Flight 9525 and flew that plane into the side of a mountain in the French Alps. And in the aftermath of that 28-year-old pilot's mass murder, people began to say things about him. Things that people saw, things that people believed because they chose to believe it. Because the truth about him was not something that he would admit, and was not something that anybody around him, for the most part, was willing to admit. Those were the statements made in the first 24 hours after the plane went into the side of that mountain. But as the story has come out, other things have been said about Andreas Lubitz. And as the story began to unfold, a picture emerged of a reason why a 28-year-old pilot would lock the co-pilot out of the cockpit and then send the plane into a steep descent while 149 people on that plane screamed and watched in horror, knowing that their lives were coming to an end, because in his beginning was not only his end, but their end. And people die every day in the United States today because of the trauma from the beginning of this person that ends up causing these people to be in the splash zone of that trauma impact. That's who Andreas Lubitz really was. But if you really want to understand Andreas Lubitz, you have to, I believe, go back to childhood. And nobody yet is going there. And do you know the only thing that's come out of this in a change in anything going on in the airline industry since that mass murder? European airlines have decided that they need to have 2 pilots in the cockpit at all times. That's the big policy change in Europe after this massive, unbelievable, heinous mass murder. Let's put another pilot in the cockpit, instead of focusing on what really went on with him, because in his beginning, I'm convinced, was his end. T.S. Eliot was right in one sense. Without intervention, trauma impacts last a lifetime. When we talk about children and trauma, we have to say it. It's true. We don't say it in a way that stigmatizes, or we shouldn't. We don't say it in a way that Christian felt and many children have experienced when we say they're screwed up kids, they have issues, they have problems, they're truants, they're deviants, they're delinquents. That is never going to get us anywhere. Without our work, though, T.S. Eliot was right. This is the truth. With our work, though, I believe that we can change the endings for virtually every child exposed to trauma. Tomorrow we're going to hear from Dr. Vincent Felitti, the co-author of the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. Before you came to this conference, a little over 300 of you so far have completed the ACE survey and the HOPE Index and a Health and Wellness Index. We're the first national domestic violence conference ever to administer that to our attendees. It's being meta-analyzed by the University of Oklahoma right now, and Dr. Chan Hellman, who will be joining us at this conference. And I will tell you about the room. 87% of you have at least one child trauma marker in your lives. And almost 79% of you have 2 or more trauma markers in your lives from the ACE study. 25% of you are a 4 or above on an ACE. We are people of trauma. It's us. Welcome. It's good to be together. We celebrate. We celebrate because we're not who we are in spite of what happened to us. We're who we are because of what's happened to us. And that deserves a celebration. Two years ago, I started writing Cheering for the Children. It was the most painful journey of my life. I didn't find out about my dad being punched in the head, by the way, until writing the book. My dad died in 2009. I didn't know. My mom told me. My dad was too ashamed and embarrassed to tell me. She said he couldn't imagine telling me that he planned to kill his father. I didn't find out until the writing of the book. Because of what happened in my home, my brother actually plans to kill my father. My family didn't know that. I interviewed all 3 of my kids for the book, by the way, adult, grown children, because I wanted to know how my issues had impacted them. That's not for the faint of heart, by the way. Don't go home and do that unless you've really got a lot of professional support. But in the journey of Cheering for the Children, I realized a couple of things that I believe frame this conference, and it's why we picked the theme for this conference. Because everybody in this room has to understand the impacts of trauma. Because no one should leave this conference without understanding the adverse childhood experience study, the elements of it, the components of it, the context of it. In Cheering for the Children, I actually ask everybody reading the book to take the ACE questionnaire at the beginning of the book to find out what's going on with their childhood trauma. And if you're a 0, God bless you. My wife's a 0. My grandfather would have been an 8. My dad was a 6. I had 3 trauma markers in the ACE questionnaire. My children are all 0s. By the grace of God, my children are all 0s. Doesn't mean they don't have issues. Doesn't mean they don't have struggles in their life. Doesn't mean they don't have some impacts from my stuff in their lives. But they're 0s. We want to understand the ACE study. We want to truly leave this conference living out what it means to be trauma-informed. If I hear the phrase trauma-informed too many more times without any context, I might throw up. I'm hearing it all over America. I hear it everywhere we go. I hear all about it over and over in theory. But we want to live it. We want to bring it into who we are as professionals doing this work. I also have another dream in this conference. I want you to understand hope theory. Hope is life, and hopelessness leads to death. It does. Andreas Lubitz was hopeless. He went to hopeless. Hope always points toward the future, and hope always points toward a better way to live your life than hopelessness does. Hopelessness always goes backwards. Hopelessness is always looking back. It's always trapped in the trauma and trapped in the past. And hope always looks forward. So we want to talk about hope theory a little bit this week. And we just chose a new tagline for our organization, creating pathways to hope. It's not an accident. It's not a catchy little phrase. We actually believe in hope theory that everything comes down to 2 things. It comes down to people having the motivation and the support to change what's going on in their lives. And they have to have a pathway to get there. Because if they don't have a pathway, they'll give up and they'll go back and they'll be trapped in it and they'll suffer the consequences, and those trauma impacts will destroy them. But if they have the motivation and if they have a pathway, they can find their way to healing and to a future. So we want to talk about pathways to hope. And my dream is that at the end of this conference, every one of you views yourself as a hope giver. When we work with children in trauma, my job with every child I interact with is to be a hope giver. How many police officers do we have in this room? Can you stand for a minute? Every police officer, law enforcement officer, sworn law enforcement officer, will you just stand for me? These are the folks in the room that get up every day and put their lives on the line every day they go to work, risking their life. But there's another thing that they can do to give hope besides risking their lives. Every law enforcement officer in this room, when you're talking to a child and you get down on their level, you can be a hope giver. Your words are power. Your words are everything different than what they're seeing and living at home. And when you say, I'm really proud of you, and I love who you are, and I love that you're willing to talk to me about this, and I believe there's a future for you. You don't deserve to be treated like this. There's help out there. This can be different for your family. I want to help you. Other people want to help you. This is not right what's happening in your home. When you start to say things to children that validates that their experience is not normal, it's not the way it's supposed to be, man, you're a hope giver. Every therapist in this room knows what it's like to give hope. Every advocate in this room knows what it's like to give hope. But prosecutors can be hope givers, and judges can be hope givers, and probation officers and parole officers. We all need to be hope givers. Every doctor, every nurse needs to be a hope giver. That's the goal. Whoops. That's the goal of all of this. Maslow in 1955 put something different at the top of this hierarchy. He put self-actualization. But you know what it really was, self-actualization? It's hope. He was talking about hope. Our goal, we together, is to bring everybody from the bottom of this pyramid to the top of this pyramid. And for too many years in this movement, we've gotten them through the first pyramid, but not the second, or through the second pyramid, but not the third. And we've gotten them some connection, but it doesn't last, because if you're a program providing services, your services end. And then you kind of say, good luck, because you haven't welcomed them into a community. Those children don't feel like they're part of a community. They were just somewhere where they met some people that they're never going to see again. We have to become a community, because only communities can produce hope like this. So I want to just close with a couple things. I was reading during the writing of Cheering for the Children, and Mother Teresa's quote about hope just grabbed me. Whatever else we do, we've got to give hope. We've got to be about hope. Whatever happens, whatever else we struggle with, whatever we fail at, if you don't gather every piece of evidence at a crime scene, you can still give hope. If you're not able to get a conviction in every case you ever prosecute as a prosecutor, you can still give hope. You may have a victim in an emergency room that does not want to tell you everything that's going on in her life to a total stranger that she just met in a nightmare, loud, banging around ER with the craziest group of people. I was just in an ER. Man, that's a bad place to have to go for help. No offense to the medical people in the room. If she doesn't want to tell you your story, her whole story, you can still give her hope. This is the ACE study in basically one slide. The first half of it is trauma impacts documented in the 20-year study of ACEs. The second half are the consequences of that trauma without mitigation, without intervention, without somebody helping a child to go this way instead of that way, without somebody helping an adult to go this way out of trauma instead of that way out of trauma. That's the ACE study in one slide. And this is what hope looks like in one slide. This is what trauma-informed care looks like in one slide. Because this is what heals trauma. And yes, people sometimes need professional intervention and professional help. But I actually don't think every trauma survivor does. Most of you in this room that have trauma in your lives haven't had professional counseling. I wish I'd gone a lot sooner. I didn't go to counseling until just about 5 years ago in my life. I wish I'd gone when I was 20, 15. Would have helped a lot if somebody intervened a lot sooner in my life. But that's what our goal is this week, to figure out and how to incorporate into who we are and what we do. With every child we're working with every adult we're working with. This is Monique Trujillo, and this is what hope looks like in a child with a high trauma score, who has hope, who has cheerleaders, who's a child that should be suffering all of the consequences of impacts of a ton of bad stuff in her life. And in 6 weeks, she's getting on a plane to go to London to represent the United States of America as an ambassador for the federal government of the United States. We need to be in the hope business with children. We need to see that that's who children of trauma and abuse can become. But we got to intervene. We got to know their story, and we got to be able to help them a long time before they end up in the cockpit of a plane at 28. Hope always needs two things. Two things. And I ask you this week, when you're processing all these sessions, to think about it. I ask you to think about it when you're working with children after you go home. Hope always needs two things to exist. Every child needs a cheerleader, and every child needs a pathway. If every child in America had a real cheerleader, somebody who passionately loved him and believed in him, somebody who wasn't compromised in their cheerleading by their own trauma and their own abuse, somebody who could really just say how special they are and unique they are, and not be with them, by the way, for the average mentor length in America, in the biggest mentoring program in America, which is Big Brothers Big Sisters, which is only about a year, the average length of a mentor relationship. Not be with them in a CASA model, which is, CASA program is great, but it's not real advocacy. It's more system stuff. Somebody that can really love that child. If they had a cheerleader from the age of 6 or 7 to 18, it would change the world. The best mentoring program in America, by the way, started in Portland, Oregon. They have paid mentors, one mentor for every 8 kids, salary and benefited mentors. They just finished their first cohort. Virtually every child went to college. Virtually every child stayed out of the juvenile justice system. Virtually every child came through that journey of trauma and violence and abuse and oppression in their lives. Impacted sometimes more in communities of color, impacted more sometimes because of historic oppression. I want to, by the way, thank and honor. We have 10 tribal nations here at this conference. We honor you. We honor you for your work. We honor you for your story. And we honor you for your willingness to come and to be part of this with us. Not just 10 countries, not just 35 states, but 10 tribal nations. So thank you to our Native American community that's part of this conference as well. Because historic oppression and racism and poverty are magnifiers in everything that we know about the ACE study. The other side of that is when we tell the truth about that and we acknowledge the significance of that, we can do something about it. It's why Bishop Desmond Tutu was right when he was asked what justice was, by the way. He said justice is 3 things. First, justice is telling the truth about injustice. And we need to tell the truth. We need to tell the truth about what's happened in our country, in our communities, in our families, in our relationships. We need to tell the truth. And then he said justice is about trying to repair the harm, as best we can, trying to repair the harm. And then he said injustice is about changing the conditions that caused the injustice in the first place. We need to be about all 3 of those things in a conference that talks about family justice. Because justice isn't found simply in a legal system. In fact, rarely is it. Justice is found in relationships among people that honor each other and support each other and accept stories without condemnation or shame or humiliation, and then move forward toward healing and hope. So that's what it's all about. Everybody needs a cheerleader, and that cheerleader is always relationship-based. Nobody ever overcomes high levels of trauma by themselves. It doesn't happen. Nobody ever says, I had a terrible childhood, I had a lot of major issues in my life, and just all alone, I figured it all out. I mean, you could be a high resiliency person and maybe have a shot at that with your innate resiliency, but I guarantee you that sooner or later, somebody that overcomes trauma is going to say, I had a coach, I had a teacher, it was my mom, it was my dad, it was my uncle, it was a next door neighbor, it was my youth minister, it was somebody in my life that loved me and believed in me. And when you find adult trauma victims that didn't have it in childhood, You know what happens in adulthood? They say, I had a sister, I had a brother, I had a friend, I had some woman that really cared about me, I had some man that said, you know what, you don't deserve to have to go through this. I can help you figure it out. You can heal from this. They always say they have somebody. It's always about a cheerleader in some form with a child and with an adult. And it's always about a pathway. This is a little road on a piece of property called Bethel Ranch that my wife and I bought 3 years ago. It's a 612-acre ranch in Arroyo Grande, California. There's nothing happening with it right now. It's totally undeveloped. I don't have a dime to my name to do anything with it. But I took the picture because that's what a pathway looks like. There has to be a pathway too, not just a cheerleader, but a pathway. A pathway where you can find your way to hope and healing. And every one of us needs to be doing each of those things. So that's my challenge to you all this week. That's my challenge throughout the conference. For every child, for every adult we work with, are we cheerleaders helping survivors of trauma and abuse to find a pathway to hope? I don't care what your profession. You can ask the question this week, how can I be a better cheerleader? How can I be a better pathway to hope? Because I guarantee you that we can all do better at this. When you're dealing with a trauma victim from a sexual assault, law enforcement officers, and her story's a jumbled mess like David Lezak's going to talk about in a few minutes, you can be a cheerleader for her. You can be objective and still tell her you're proud of her and that you honor her and that you honor the fear and the difficulty and the challenge it is to tell the story, that you honor her for what she's been through and what she's experienced. You can still be a cheerleader. You can tell her whatever choices you have to make in this and whatever path you want to go, there is a pathway, and I want to help you find that pathway. You can do that. That's not a violation of your objectivity. That's called trauma-informed interviewing. That's called understanding that their story is going to be the jumbled mess, and it will never be linear. It's a torn up piece of paper on the floor, and you're expecting them to pick up all those pieces and give them to you in a row, and it's never going to happen. But you can still be a cheerleader and still be a pathway. That's our goal, every one of us in this room. This is my love affair. This is Katie Brooke Orender. I dedicated Cheering for the Children to her. She's a child 2 generations away from violence and abuse. She's a child 3 generations away from a man with an ACE score of 8. And she's a child now growing up in the home of my oldest daughter and her husband, where their ACE scores are 0. And by the way, Tyler's mom would have been a 6. My son-in-law's mom. They're breaking the cycle in that family too. And we're breaking the cycle in my family. And that's what hope and healing looks like. It may not all happen in our generation. It may not all happen with you. It may happen with your kids. It may happen with your grandkids. And the great thing about grandkids is, if you messed up with your kids, it's like a redo. It's a redo, and you don't have to change the diapers if you don't want to. It's the best. That's what hope looks like. That's the power of all this. So as we go into this week, my challenge to you is lean in. Gail said it this morning, lean in. Build relationships, dialogue, talk. Figure out how all of us have a role to play to help survivors of violence and abuse go down that road. Because hope is the life-giving force that we need in our lives if we're going to heal and go forward instead of go backwards. But for my faith and my family, most of you know, this work is the most important thing in my life. When I met Gail Strack 30 years ago, I never imagined that 30 years later I'd be standing here. And we both have our own stories that we've had to process in our own lives of things that happened before we got into this work in our families. But you know what? We're here because we're using that experience to change the future. It was my dad who said a person with an experience is never at the mercy of a person with an argument. Don't ever forget that. Your story is power. Your experience is power. The voices of survivors are power. Letting children tell their stories is power. And power produces empowerment. And empowerment produces competency and resiliency. And competency and resiliency produce hope. And hope produce healing. And so we change the world. God bless you all. Thank you very much.